It is often said that the late 1970s were a hiatus or dead spot in terms of interest for monster movies like Toho's classic kaiju films. Perhaps this is true, but the monster King Godzilla and other giant monsters or kaiju films were still a common sight on local television stations, both late at night and on lazy Saturday afternoons. In addition to this, other giant monsters are fighting their way into popular media of all sorts. Godzilla himself briefly joined the Marvel Comics universe and became the star of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon that was popular on Saturday mornings. Even the silver screen was alive with giant beasts, and the grandfather of them all, the monster ape King Kong, would see a reboot or reimagining around this time period. But the giant monster craze was not just reflected in comics, television, and the movie screen. Toys began to reflect the popular media, and soon giant toy monsters were being offered in stores and catalogs. Truly behemoth toys that dwarfed the other toys of the time. Let's open by looking at a page from a Spiegel catalog from 1978. Here we can see some of the earliest representatives of these types of toys as this giant toy monster craze really started to get moving. And to be fair, I should mention that giant monster toys were not new, and large toy beasts such as the Great Garloo had been around for over a decade prior. But the late 1970s brought a wave of giant monster toys, the likes of which had never been seen before. So let's start up this giant monster toy safari, and one of our first stops will be at Clan Stretch to take a look at one of the most classic of toy monsters, the Stretch Monster. The Stretch Monster was produced by the toy company Kenner and released in 1978. He was billed as the rival or nemesis to the heroic Stretch Armstrong. For those not familiar with Stretch Armstrong, he was a doll-like action figure who was mostly made out of soft latex and filled with gel, so he could be stretched out of shape, but he would return true. The Stretch Monster was a giant mean green machine. He was about 13 inches tall, molded to look scaly, and featured one of the best monster head sculpts of all time. While this guy was made to tangle with Mr. Armstrong, there is no way a monster toy this cool didn't end up throwing down with so many other toys from other toy lines throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. Just look at this guy. He could easily become an enemy for the Shogun Warriors, or a monster that He-Man would need to take down. He could be used with anything. There have been many videos, websites, and blogs dedicated to this guy, and he is one of the true monster toy classics. But we've got a lot to cover in this video, and we're going to need to move on, because this guy was not the only stretchy monster on the block in the late 1970s. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Kenner's Stretch Serpent, yet another green reptilian enemy of Stretch Armstrong. This guy was big, and was billed as being able to stretch over 3 feet long. He was also billed as the Loch Ness Creature, so I guess he was Scottish. Look at those eyes. His eyes have seen some things. And you know what that means. It's time to zoom in and cue up the suspenseful music. They're not wearing anything under those kilts. It just stares into your 3-year-old soul, judging. My understanding is that this toy is really difficult to find these days, and I don't think it was particularly easy to find even when it was brand new. This is yet another of the Stretch clan that could easily play with toys from many other toy lines. And one more thing, just on a side note, the Stretch Serpent head seems to closely resemble the head of a Sleestak from the television show The Land of the Lost. I, 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 But there were so many more giant toy monsters from this period of toy history. You know, I think one thing that all of these giant toy monsters have in common is that they all had so much potential for crossplay with other toys and other toy lines. The next one is one I owned and loved, though I never really owned the toy line that it actually belonged to. The gigantic Terron, the Beast from Beyond. Released in 1978 by Hasbro, it belonged to the Super Joe toy line. Super Joe was a strange but incredibly interesting era in G.I. Joe toy history. It was a sci-fi themed offshoot of G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe was sort of in a weird place between the large dog ears and the popular 3 3/4 inch action figure toy line, and this neat but brief incarnation was the result. The Terron was created to be an alien monster enemy of Super Joe, and it was kind of part dinosaur, part insect, and part armadillo, but it was all awesome. It even had a little of that Tundro from Herculoids vibe going on. And this toy was huge. It was made of hard plastic and it measured around 18 inches long. It was even motorized and could crawl forward on those 6 legs when activated. Even the eyes on this guy were cool. It's hard to see, but the eyes were created of a red translucent plastic, and they were compound, like an insect's eyes. In general, the Super Joe line had a light sensor gimmick going on, and Super Joe himself wore an armor vest with a flashlight built into the chest. The Terron had a small light sensor under its head, so when the light hit the sensor, it would temporarily stop the Terron's forward motion. It was said that the beast was temporarily stunned. This was one of my favorite toys as a kid, and I used it for play with so many other toy lines. Sometimes it was an alien creature in Star Wars. Other times it was an Eternian beast for He-Man to fight. It could even be a large insect creature to supplement the Sectaurs toys. But originally I got it to be another kaiju-type toy to fight Godzilla. It was one of the best toy monsters ever. And I guess that will bring me to the real show. The beating atomic mutated heart of giant monster toys of the late 1970s. But I guess to really showcase these, we need to jump a little forward in time to get a holistic picture, as seen here on this page from the 1980s JCPenney's Christmas catalog. So let's get right to it and take a good look at this group of 5 huge monstrosities from the past. Oh, and here they are, 3 of Mattel's favorite big baddies from the dimly understood prehistoric past. And while each was an exceptional example of the toy maker's art, one stands head and shoulders above all the others. In fact, you can say that he stood 30 stories above all the others. The Mattel Shogun Warriors Godzilla action figure, introduced by Mattel in 1977, he stood a towering 20 inches tall. This amazing toy was part of the Shogun Warriors toy line, a mid to late 1970s toy line brought over from Japan that was the predecessor to toy lines like Transformers, and especially to properties like Voltron. This toy line deserves a video all its own, but needless to say, it was a great toy line in and of itself. But while Godzilla was brought over to be part of the Shogun Warriors toy line, he quickly established himself as a standalone hit, and eventually sort of part of his own small toy line, but we'll get into that in a minute. For now, let's take a closer look at this magnificent beast. He featured wheels on his feet to aid in mobility, and a spring-powered launching fist. The launching fist was actually really powerful, and my Godzilla had a hair trigger, and the fist would launch sometimes accidentally and knock me flat. Playing with it was like playing a Mattel version of the Deer Hunter. It just added to the thrill. He also had one other really cool feature. Pulling a large red lever on the back of his head made a fiery tongue shoot forward out of his mouth. I guess it was to mimic Godzilla's famous fiery atomic breath. And okay, he was far from screen accurate, and his head sculpt only generally reflected the real Godzilla at best. But this was also one of my favorite toys as a kid, and one of the first toys that I remember getting. I was not much taller than this toy when I first got it, and literally drug this toy all over the place. His skin was like an avocado, and his tail was like a pickle. But he was one of the greatest toys ever. Mattel had a hit on their hands, so they quickly moved to create a friend/rival for this big fella. No, not him. Him, that's the one. The avian reptile Rodan. Mattel introduced Rodan in 1979 to go along with their giant Godzilla toy. And this guy was really huge. He didn't stand as tall as Godzilla toy, but he sported a 38-inch wingspan. He was a great companion and foe for Godzilla, but he actually wasn't part of the Shogun Warriors toy line and was billed as World's Greatest Monsters toy line. He had quite a few unique play features all his own. He featured rubber band-powered grasping claws, wings that flapped when you shook him up and down, and a lever on the back of his neck that moved his jaw up and down and created clicking noises that were supposed to be interpreted as squawking. It's sort of like how moving the turret on the Millennium Falcon created clicking noises that were supposed to be interpreted as gunfire. Another great giant toy monster that could be used to play with tons of other toys. And there are still more giant monster toys offered on this catalog page. And like on this catalog page, the next was often marketed right alongside Godzilla and Rodan. Introduced in 1980, this is Gre-gory, the big bad vampire bat. While not a kaiju like Rodan or Godzilla, Gre-gory was a relatively large toy with a 10-inch wingspan. He was generally made of soft rubber, but had a chest made of transparent plastic so you could see inside of his body, under his skin, to his rib cage and internal organs. But the real show was when you pressed on his back, and you could watch blood flow down the transparent chest and into his stomach. Part monster toy, part Halloween decoration, I think Mattel and department stores often marketed him alongside Godzilla and Rodan because they weren't sure what to do with him. And by 1980, Mattel was leaning heavily into the giant toy monster genre and was offering quite a few of them. Now let's take a look at two more giant monster toys that were offered during this time. This is the giant beast called Krusher. Krusher was introduced in 1979 by Mattel. Standing about 14 inches high, his body was made of soft rubber except for his belt, which is made of hard orange plastic. And as a monster toy, Krusher looked great, but he was primarily designed around a gimmick. On the back side of his belt was a small airtight valve. Krusher's body was generally hollow, and when you opened the airtight valve on the back of his belt, you could force the air out of his body and crush him into a ball. Then, pressing the valve back into place created an airtight seal, and he could be temporarily kept in a crushed state. Then reopening the valve meant that the air would flow back into the body and reinflate the toy to its full giant 14-inch height. Molded to be a scaly, muscled, troll-like monster, this guy was somewhere between a creature from Conan the Barbarian, an enemy of the Incredible Hulk, and a monster pro wrestler. In fact, for me, this toy was such a regular when I played with my He-Man and the Masters of the Universe toys that I have a difficult time not thinking of it as part of the Masters of the Universe toy line. It just seemed to fit so well. And there is one more large monster toy that was offered during this time on just this catalog page alone. In 1978, Mattel released the beast known as Suckerman. Suckerman stood 12 inches tall, if he could stand, but really he couldn't because he was made of one whole piece of soft moldable rubber or vinyl. He had suction cups all over his body and an alien, vaguely vampiric face. The gimmick for this toy was that you could throw him against a flat surface, and using the suction cups, he would stick to it. He came in several colors, including red, green, and black. Mattel would also offer the glow-in-the-dark Suckerman, and I'm sure this version became the Suckerman of choice for many kids in the early 1980s. But since we mentioned Marvel's most famous green monster when we discussed the Krusher toy, I wanted to take a brief look at this gem. This was the Incredible Hulk Rage Cage toy by Fun Stuff. Released in 1978, this Hulk toy stood 12 inches tall and had a body that was made out of soft rubber. Well, at least the top half of his body was. It also came with a ragged shirt that was loosely held on by Velcro, and a flimsy plastic cage. But there was actually a reason this cage was so flimsy. The toy also came with a small air pump that could be attached to a small opening on the Hulk's back. Squeezing the pump would inject air into the Hulk's torso, causing it to swell and tear through the shirt, and if you're lucky, break open the flimsy cage. It was another great large monster toy. Eventually, the 1970s would go back to the ocean, and a new decade of giant monster toys would begin. Many of the monster toys from the prior decade would continue to hang around for a few years, and Mattel would offer yet another great giant monster toy along with the toy line for the film Clash of the Titans. Released into theaters in 1981, Clash of the Titans would be the last film to showcase the work of famous special effects artist Ray Harryhausen. It would also get a small toy line from Mattel, who was throwing their hats into all sorts of rings in hopes of getting a Star Wars-like hit on their hands. While the toy line was actually pretty great, and was one of the first sword and sorcery action figure lines available, the real gem of the series was the giant toy of the sea monster called the Kraken. The Kraken toy stood 14 inches tall and had 4 arms articulated by ball joints, as well as a removable tail. This was yet another great Mattel monster toy, and one again that could be easily used with other toy lines, and I often found that was set against Mattel's Godzilla during my childhood. Which brings us to 1985. The toy company Imperial who I've talked about in other videos on this channel, and who had already brought us great generic monsters for play with so many other toy lines, got the license to produce official Godzilla toys and merchandise. This led to the introduction of some of the most fondly remembered monster toys of the 1980s. Two of the most popular were the rubber and slightly articulated 8-inch King Kong and 6-inch Godzilla toys. This Godzilla is one of the most fondly remembered versions of the big, mean lizard, but this video is dedicated to giant monster toys, and not toys of giant monsters. So luckily, Imperial also introduced a 13-inch tall Godzilla figure, with basically the same mold and paint job as the 6-inch version, just scaled way up. Godzilla was back, and was closer to screen accurate. But he wasn't the only big rubber kaiju stomping around toy store shelves. Other manufacturers of those cheap rubber monsters and dinosaurs like Dorme were already in the game producing giant monsters that were, well, almost Godzilla, but not quite. These guys were giant, often measuring between 13 and 14 inches high, and usually were articulated at the neck, arms, legs, and tail. They came with a pretty wide variety of paint jobs, and often the sculpts were slightly different, sometimes sporting features like a head fin, sometimes having larger or more pronounced brows or ridge spines. And if you were a kid in the 1980s, chances were you either had one of these or knew someone who did. But the times were a-changin', and the reignited interest in kaiju and other large monsters led Hasbro to try and capitalize with their own major toy line release, the Inhumanoids. Released in 1986 with a television cartoon, the Inhumanoids was actually doomed to failure, but was one of the coolest toy lines of the mid-1980s. It featured scientists in powered armored suits, with great vehicles locked in battle with giant kaiju-like monsters awoken from their slumber deep under the earth. The entire toy line deserves a really good look and may be the subject of a later video. But this video is already running long, and we're going to focus on the 3 giant monster toys offered with the line. They stood generally about 14 inches high and had great articulation and sculpts. First up is Metlar, the devil-like leader of the giant evil monsters. Based on a theme of lava and molten metal, he sported a torso that looked like scale mail and a head that looked like a giant Japanese oni. Second is the creature that was most people's probable favorite, the rotting and skeletal Decompose. In the cartoon, he wielded a zombifying touch and could imprison hapless victims in his hinged ribcage. And last was Tendril, who was my personal favorite. A giant and very strange-looking plant monster, this one was right up my alley. He was definitely his own beast, but he favored other pop culture favorites, such as Marvel's Man-Thing and D&D's Shambling Mound, and even Lovecraft's Cthulhu. Well, this video is getting a little too long, and even though there are a few toys I probably missed, I think this is going to wrap up our safari to look at many of the great giant monster toys of the late 1970s and early 1980s. While these toys could be directly associated with various toy lines or standalone toys in and of themselves, their great size, awesome looks, and general playability virtually ensured that they would see play with a myriad of different other toy lines in multiple settings, sometimes even locked in combat with each other. The child's imagination was the limit. Please hit the like button and subscribe to stay in touch with future content, and continue to join us for more adventures to look at the little things that rampaged through our backyards and across our bedroom and living room floors when we were kids.